A quiet decision inside a closed room in Ouagadougou has begun shifting the geopolitical balance of the Sahel in ways few outside observers immediately noticed. Within only a few weeks, security negotiations surrounding Burkina Faso started attracting the attention of intelligence analysts in Washington, Paris, and Brussels, who understood that something far larger than a simple military partnership might be unfolding. What could this strategic move mean for the future of African sovereignty, and why is the name Ibrahim Traoré suddenly appearing in conversations about the redesign of power structures across West Africa? Because what began as a discrete discussion may now be evolving into a transformation capable of reshaping how influence, security, and independence operate in the region. You are about to hear an explanation that many public debates reference but rarely unpack with clarity. Behind recent discussions about Burkina Faso's security partnerships lies a deeper structural question about how power, logistics, and sovereignty actually function in the Sahel. In the next minutes, this analysis will walk step by step through the mechanisms that shaped the system surrounding the country, and why recent decisions connected to Ibrahim Traoré are drawing attention from analysts across multiple continents. You will understand the real architecture behind the headlines today. And this is not information meant only for casual listening. If someone hears only the surface narrative, it becomes easy to assume that Burkina Faso is simply changing partners or signing another routine defense agreement. But missing the deeper mechanics can lead to a completely different interpretation of what is unfolding. Without examining the structure behind the decisions, observers may overlook how supply chains, financial dependencies, and intelligence networks shape the choices available to governments. And once those hidden mechanisms come into focus, the significance of what is happening in Burkina Faso becomes much harder to ignore. Analysts noticed that the conversation surrounding Burkina Faso was no longer only about security contracts, but about redesigning the system that had shaped the region for decades. One detail immediately stood out: for more than 60 years, the political and financial architecture connecting several Sahel states to former colonial structures had remained largely unchanged. To understand why this matters now, it helps to look briefly at how that architecture originally formed. After formal independence across much of West Africa, the break with European influence appeared complete on the surface. Flags changed, governments changed, constitutions were written. Yet many of the deeper mechanisms of power continued operating through financial agreements, military cooperation frameworks, and intelligence relationships that connected local decisions to institutions outside the region. One example often cited by analysts is the long-standing monetary system known as the CFA franc. Countries using that currency kept roughly half of their foreign exchange reserves in the French treasury, while the exchange rate remained tied to the euro. Monetary policy decisions affecting millions of citizens were therefore influenced by structures located far beyond their own capitals. But it also limited the room for independent economic maneuvering. Security arrangements developed in a similar way. Counterterrorism missions, training programs, and military bases created a network of partnerships intended to address regional instability. These frameworks brought equipment, intelligence cooperation, and operational support. Yet they also meant that critical elements of the security apparatus were integrated with external systems. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power in 2022, many observers initially assumed the transition would follow a familiar pattern. But the deeper architecture would remain intact. Early reactions from international analysts reflected that assumption. However, reports emerging from recent negotiations suggested a different possibility. Instead of simply replacing one external security partner with another, Burkina Faso appeared to be examining the entire structure through which military logistics, intelligence access, and supply chains had historically operated. In other words, the conversation was shifting from changing partners to changing the system itself. That distinction may sound subtle, but it represents a significant strategic difference. Most governments adjusting their defense relationships perform what analysts call a vendor swap. They replace one supplier with another while leaving the underlying architecture untouched. What observers began noticing in the Sahel looked closer to a systemic redesign. And that realization is what placed Ibrahim Traoré at the center of a much larger geopolitical discussion unfolding across West Africa. As this shift began to draw attention, observers searching for a central figure repeatedly returned to the same name. The young leader guiding Burkina Faso through this period of reassessment was Ibrahim Traoré, an army captain who rose to power during a turbulent moment in the country's security landscape. For many analysts, his role quickly became a reference point for understanding the direction the nation might take next. The early signals appeared in quiet policy discussions rather than dramatic public speeches. Reports from regional observers described internal reviews of defense arrangements, intelligence coordination, and logistics networks that had operated for years with little scrutiny. These reviews were not simply about equipment or troop numbers. They focused on how the system itself functioned and who ultimately controlled its critical nodes. One example oft unmentioned by analysts involved supply routes supporting military operations. Because Burkina Faso is a landlocked country, almost every piece of equipment from fuel to spare parts must travel through neighboring states before reaching its destination. That logistical reality gives enormous strategic importance to the corridors connecting ports on the Atlantic coast with the Sahel interior. When officials began examining those supply networks more closely, they discovered how deeply many of them were linked to commercial and intelligence structures aligned with Western partners. Changing security partnerships therefore meant more than signing new agreements. It required reconsidering the entire logistics chain that kept the defense system functioning. In discussions among regional analysts, the significance of this review process quickly became clear. If the logistical architecture changed, the balance of influence surrounding security decisions could also shift. That possibility is what drew growing attention to the policies emerging under Ibrahim Traoré. For supporters, the process looked like a long overdue attempt to reassess national sovereignty in practical terms. For critics, it raised concerns about stability and the risks involved in dismantling established systems. Either way, one conclusion was becoming difficult to avoid. The story was no longer about a single political transition. It was about a structural reassessment unfolding across the Sahel. The shift looked gradual, then the sequence accelerated. What began as quiet reviews of security relationships soon evolved into a series of decisions that started altering the strategic environment around Burkina Faso. Observers following developments in the Sahel noticed that the country was no longer approaching defense cooperation in the same way it had for decades. The first phase unfolded quietly. Internal discussions began examining existing military arrangements, intelligence sharing procedures, and supply agreements connected to foreign partners. These reviews were technical and largely invisible to the public. Yet inside policy circles they represented something significant, the first systematic attempt to map how the country's security system actually functioned. Soon after, the pace increased. Analysts reported that officials connected to Ibrahim Traoré were evaluating which parts of the security architecture were essential and which parts created long-term dependency. The questions were practical rather than ideological. Who controlled communications networks? Who provided maintenance for critical equipment? And who had visibility into the logistical pipelines that kept military operations running? Then the second phase began. Alternative partnerships started appearing in discussions about defense cooperation. These were not presented as symbolic gestures. They were connected to a deeper objective, building parallel channels through which equipment, training, and intelligence support could flow without relying exclusively on the same networks that had dominated the region for years. The shift quickly caught the attention of internal observers. When a government begins exploring new logistical corridors and alternative supply chains, analysts understand the implications extend far beyond procurement contracts. Control over logistics determines who can sustain operations during a crisis and who holds leverage during political disagreements. Momentum built quickly. Within policy circles across West Africa, conversations about the approach associated with Ibrahim Traoré began spreading. Some governments watched carefully, curious whether a new model of security cooperation was emerging. Others viewed the developments with caution, aware that altering entrenched systems can produce unexpected consequences. By the time the third phase unfolded, the change was impossible to ignore. Public announcements about expanding military relationships signaled that the reassessment was no longer theoretical. The government was actively pursuing new channels of cooperation. Yet the most important transformation was happening beneath the surface. The real objective was not simply acquiring different equipment or signing fresh agreements. It was about redefining who controlled the logistical arteries that determine how security power flows across the Sahel. Once that objective became clear, the implications grew much larger than a single country. Decisions unfolding around Ibrahim Traoré were now part of a broader regional conversation about sovereignty, influence, and strategic independence. To understand why these developments drew so much attention, analysts began examining the numbers behind the system itself. The discussion surrounding Burkina Faso was not only about political rhetoric or diplomatic signaling. It was also about measurable structures that shaped how security and economic decisions had operated across the region for decades. One frequently cited figure relates to the monetary framework used by several West African countries for generations. Under the CFA franc arrangement, roughly 50% of foreign exchange reserves from participating states were historically held in accounts managed through the French Treasury. That single statistic financial architecture influenced national policy space. When a country's reserves are partially controlled outside its own banking system, its economic flexibility becomes structurally constrained. Another set of numbers reveals the logistical dimension of security operations in the Sahel, because Burkina Faso is landlocked. Nearly 100% of heavy military equipment and fuel supplies must travel overland through neighboring countries or arrive via air corridors before reaching operational zones. This geographic reality means that the effectiveness of any defense strategy depends heavily on the reliability of external supply routes, when those routes are controlled or monitored by external actors. A third metric highlights the scale of the security challenge the region faces. According to several international assessments, violent incidents connected to armed groups in the Sahel increased dramatically during the past decade, with some estimates suggesting a rise of more than 300% in certain areas between 2015 and 2023. The numbers do not tell the entire story, but they demonstrate the pressure placed on governments attempting to stabilize vast rural territories with limited resources. These statistics help explain why the approach associated with Ibrahim Traoré attracted attention beyond Burkina Faso itself. Observers realized that if the country successfully diversified its logistical networks and security partnerships, it could reduce the strategic pressure created by those structural constraints. In practical terms, that would mean fewer single points of dependency within the system. Numbers alone do not determine political outcomes, but they often reveal the underlying mechanics of power. In the case of Burkina Faso, the data suggested that decisions being explored by Ibrahim Traoré were connected to more than symbolic diplomacy. They were part of a broader attempt to reshape the structural conditions under which the country managed security, finance, and strategic autonomy. Once those structural conditions came into view, the significance of the debate became clearer. What looked like a series of isolated policy adjustments was actually connected to a deeper effort to modify the architecture that had shaped the Sahel's geopolitical landscape for generations. As discussions around these developments intensified, it also became clear that not everyone viewed the changes in the same way. Major structural shifts rarely produce unanimous agreement. Different observers interpret the same actions through very different strategic lenses, and the situation surrounding Burkina Faso is no exception. One common argument raised by critics focuses on stability. From this perspective, the long-standing network of Western security partnerships in the Sahel, despite its imperfections, provided predictable coordination between intelligence agencies, militaries, and international institutions. Critics argue that dismantling or bypassing these arrangements too quickly could create operational gaps. Even temporary disruptions in intelligence sharing or logistics could complicate counterterrorism efforts. Supporters of this view often emphasize that complex security systems cannot be redesigned overnight, and intelligence networks typically evolve over many years. Altering them requires careful planning to avoid unintended consequences. For these analysts, the central concern is not the idea of sovereignty itself, but the speed at which structural changes occur. However, a different interpretation is equally present in policy debates. Advocates of the approach associated with Ibrahim Traore argue that dependency can itself become a strategic vulnerability when a country relies heavily on a limited number of external partners for security logistics. Those partners inevitably gain leverage over national decision-making. From this perspective, diversification is not destabilizing but necessary for long-term autonomy. Supporters also point to historical patterns across several regions where states gradually expanded their diplomatic and defense partnerships to reduce reliance on a single power bloc. In their view, Burkina Faso's reassessment reflects a broader trend in international politics where emerging multipolar relationships create new options for smaller states. When these two perspectives are placed side by side, the debate becomes less about ideology and more about timing and execution. The question is not simply whether sovereignty should increase, but how quickly the underlying systems supporting that sovereignty can realistically be rebuilt. That balance between caution and transformation lies at the center of the discussions surrounding Ibrahim Traore. Understanding both viewpoints helps clarify why the situation in the Sahel is in diplomatic circles far beyond the region itself. Then something shifted. As analysts continued examining the evolving strategy in Burkina Faso, a deeper realization began emerging. The story was not only about one country reconsidering its partnerships. It was about a larger change taking place in the global system that determines how influence and security operate. For decades, Western institutions dominated the financial networks, logistics systems, and intelligence channels that supported military cooperation in many regions of the world. Governments seeking assistance often had limited alternatives, and funding typically flowed through the same well-established corridors. But in recent years, new infrastructure has begun appearing across multiple domains. New development financing models and expanding defense supply networks have created options that did not previously exist. These systems do not completely replace older ones, but they introduce competition into a space that once functioned almost like a monopoly. This change matters because leverage depends on exclusivity. When only one route exists for financing, logistics, or intelligence support, the actor controlling that route holds enormous influence. The moment additional routes appear, that leverage begins to weaken. In this context, the strategy linked to Ibrahim Traore started to look less like an isolated national policy and more like a local expression of a broader global transition. Burkina Faso was exploring how these new alternatives could be used to reduce reliance on a single network of partnerships. The implications extend beyond military cooperation. They affect financial flows, diplomatic alignments, and long-term development planning. If multiple infrastructures continue expanding, countries across the global south may gradually gain greater room to maneuver between competing systems. And that possibility changes the strategic landscape. What once appeared to be a simple geopolitical choice might actually be part of a much larger structural transformation now unfolding across international politics. The consequences of that structural shift did not remain confined to diplomatic discussions. As the reassessment of security partnerships unfolded, its effects began touching multiple layers of political and economic life across the region. What initially appeared as a strategic adjustment in Burkina Faso gradually produced implications that extended far beyond military planning rooms. For governments, the first impact appeared in the realm of policy pressure. Decisions about security cooperation suddenly carried broader geopolitical weight. When a country begins exploring alternative defense relationships, it can trigger diplomatic responses from long-standing partners who see their influence diminishing. Policymakers had to navigate a delicate balance between asserting national autonomy and maintaining workable relations with international institutions that still play major roles in development and security programs. Businesses also began watching these developments carefully. Companies operating in sectors such as mining, agriculture, and logistics depend heavily on stability and predictable infrastructure. Burkina Faso is a significant gold producer in West Africa, and investors often evaluate political decisions through the lens of supply reliability and transport routes. Particularly those linked to security can influence how investors calculate risk and opportunity across the region. For ordinary citizens, the effects are more personal. Security conditions in parts of the Sahel have directly influenced livelihoods, access to farmland, and movement between communities. When governments attempt to redesign defense strategies, people living in affected areas watch closely to see whether the changes translate into improved stability on the ground. The debates surrounding Ibrahim Traoré therefore connects not only to geopolitical theory, but also to the daily concerns of families navigating uncertainty. The regional dimension is equally important. Neighboring states such as Mali and Niger have engaged in similar conversations about sovereignty and security cooperation. Together, these countries form part of a bloc that analysts increasingly view as experimenting with new strategic alignments within the Sahel. If these experiments reshape how security systems operate, the ripple effects could influence diplomatic dynamics throughout West Africa. Seen from this broader perspective, the developments unfolding around Ibrahim Traoré are no longer confined to a single government's policy choices. They represent a moment when questions about sovereignty, partnership, and regional stability intersect in ways that affect states, markets, and communities simultaneously. And once those forces begin interacting, the consequences rarely remain limited to one country alone. Looking ahead, analysts often explore several possible directions the situation could take depending on how decisions unfold in the coming years. They are simply frameworks that help observers think about the strategic possibilities created by the changes currently taking shape around Burkina Faso and the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré. The most probable scenario is gradual adjustment. In this path, Burkina Faso continues expanding partnerships while maintaining selective cooperation with traditional allies. Security institutions adapt slowly as new logistical channels develop alongside existing ones. The result would likely be a mixed system where different partners contribute equipment, training, and financial resources. Stability might improve incrementally, though tensions with certain international actors could persist as influence becomes more evenly distributed. A more optimistic scenario would involve successful institutional reform accompanying these strategic shifts. If the country manages to strengthen administrative transparency, judicial oversight, and economic planning while diversifying security cooperation, the changes could produce a stronger foundation for long-term sovereignty. The policies associated with Ibrahim Traoré might evolve into a model demonstrating how smaller states can balance multiple partnerships without falling into exclusive dependency. The most challenging scenario centers on instability during the transition. Rebuilding or redirecting complex security networks always carries operational risks. If logistical adjustments disrupt counter-terrorism operations or if new partnerships fail to deliver reliable support quickly enough, security conditions could temporarily worsen. Such outcomes would complicate both domestic governance and regional diplomacy. The reality will likely fall somewhere between these possibilities. Strategic transformations rarely follow a straight line. What matters most is how effectively institutions adapt to changing conditions and whether political leadership can translate geopolitical ambition into sustainable governance. For observers watching developments around Ibrahim Traoré, the coming years will reveal whether this moment represents a temporary recalibration or the beginning of a deeper structural shift in the Sahel. The institutional debates and the possible futures ahead, one final question naturally emerges. What does all of this actually mean for the people watching this story unfold from outside the Sahel? Understanding events in Burkina Faso is not only about following international news. It is also about recognizing how global power structures evolve and how those shifts eventually influence economies, alliances, and security environments around the world. For viewers who actively follow global politics, the developments connected to Ibrahim Traoré provide an opportunity to observe a rare moment when a country attempts to rethink the architecture of its partnerships. These moments are historically significant because they reveal how international systems adapt over time. Observers who study such transitions often gain a deeper understanding of how influence moves and how strategic decisions reshape regions. For those indirectly affected, the implications may appear less immediate but still important. Changes in geopolitical relationships can influence global supply chains, investment flows, and diplomatic alignments. When regions rich in natural resources or strategic corridors begin redefining their partnerships, those shifts often ripple outward through markets and international policy discussions. There is also a third group of observers who may feel distant from the issue entirely. Yet even for them, understanding the broader context matters. Global stability, economic opportunity, and international cooperation are all shaped by decisions made in places that may initially seem far away. Ignoring those developments can make it harder to anticipate changes that eventually influence everyday life. Regardless of which group someone belongs to, learning about these dynamics provides a clearer view of how international systems evolve. And in a world where power structures are constantly shifting, awareness becomes one of the most valuable tools any observer can have. When discussions turn toward the future of sovereignty in the Sahel, one conclusion appears repeatedly among analysts. Real change requires more than bold declarations. Strategic independence cannot rely only on new alliances or symbolic decisions. It depends on institutions capable of sustaining their independence over time. For the leadership in Burkina Faso, including Ibrahim Traoré, the first step involves strengthening national decision-making capacity. That means building administrative systems that can evaluate security partnerships transparently and ensure that agreements serve long-term national interests. Clear oversight mechanisms and reliable financial management allow governments to negotiate from a position of confidence rather than dependency. A second step involves the practical side: infrastructure and logistics. Security strategies cannot function without reliable supply chains, transport corridors, and technical expertise. Developing diversified logistical networks, whether for military equipment, fuel, or communication systems, helps reduce vulnerability to external pressure while improving operational flexibility. The third step extends beyond government institutions. Businesses, research institutions, and civil society organizations also play roles in sustaining sovereignty. When local industries expand technical capabilities and educational systems train specialists in finance, engineering, and security analysis, the country gradually develops the expertise needed to manage complex partnerships independently. Regional cooperation can form another layer of resilience. Collaboration between neighboring states in areas such as intelligence sharing, infrastructure development, and economic planning can strengthen stability across borders while reducing reliance on distant actors. Ultimately, the long-term success of the policies associated with Ibrahim Traoré will not be measured only by diplomatic announcements. It will be measured by whether institutions, economic structures, and accountability systems become strong enough to support genuine autonomy for years to come. Earlier in the story, attention returned again and again to the moment when the direction of Burkina Faso began shifting. A series of quiet discussions, a reassessment of long-standing systems, and a growing debate about sovereignty slowly transformed what once looked like routine policy decisions. That moment continues to frame how observers understand the journey that has unfolded since. At the center of that turning point stands Ibrahim Traoré, a leader whose rise coincided with a broader questioning of how power and dependency have historically operated in the Sahel. His role in this moment has made him both a symbol of possibility for supporters and a subject of careful scrutiny for critics watching the region's future. Over the course of this discussion, the story moved from the architecture of past systems to the challenges of building new ones. It explored the mechanics of security partnerships, the influence of logistics and financial networks, and the debate over whether emerging strategies can truly produce lasting autonomy. Each layer revealed how complex the path towards sovereignty can be. In the end, the story is not only about one government or one policy shift. It is about the long process through which nations attempt to define their own direction in a world shaped by powerful external forces. and the deeper question remains. What kind of system will ultimately emerge from the choices being made today? As this conversation comes to a close, one thing becomes clear. Stories like this are rarely just about a single country or a single leader. They are about larger questions: how nations navigate power, how systems evolve, and how people across different regions interpret moments of change. The developments surrounding Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso invite observers to think carefully about sovereignty, partnerships, and the long-term architecture of global influence. Some viewers may see these events as the beginning of a new strategic path. Others may view them as one stage in a longer historical cycle that has repeated itself in different form. If this story helped you see the situation from a deeper angle, then it may also be worth sharing the conversation with others who follow global affairs. Sometimes a single discussion can open the door for broader understanding and more thoughtful dialogue. And perhaps the most important part of this story is the question it leaves behind. What kind of international system should smaller nations build in order to protect their sovereignty while still cooperating with the wider world? Your perspective on that question matters because the future of global cooperation will ultimately be shaped by conversations like this one.